I'm Glenn Gazer, professor in the College of Health Solutions at Arizona State University. I'm the author of a new paper just published in the medical journal Trends in Cardiovascular Medicine that looked at the relationship between refined grain intake and risk of cardiovascular disease. I performed meta-analyses using data from large cohort studies that included more than 875,000 men and women from regions throughout the world. And the results of these meta-analyses show that a high intake of refined grain foods is not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And it did not matter if the analyses were restricted to staple refined grain foods such as bread and cereal and pasta, or also included indulgent refined grain foods such as cakes, cookies, pastries, doughnuts, brownies, and so forth. In all instances, there was no relationship whatsoever between a high intake of these refined grain foods and risk of cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, heart attack, heart failure, or stroke. Now, these new results call into question the widely held view that refined grain foods are associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, how do I explain the discrepancy? It's quite straightforward. The widely held view that refined grain foods increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, that view is based largely upon dietary pattern research. And in this type of research, refined grains are included in a dietary pattern that also includes red and processed meat, sugar-sweetened beverages, French fries, high-fat dairy products. And it's very likely that these foods are the real culprits within this dietary pattern, not refined grains. In fact, the current study, based upon meta-analyses that restrict refined grain foods to a single distinct category, not as a pattern, show quite clearly that refined grain intake is not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, it is my hope that these new results will be considered in the formulation of future dietary guidelines for Americans. In the meantime, I think it's important that the nutrition community acknowledges these results, and while still promoting, rightfully so, increased consumption of whole grain foods, it doesn't have to come at the expense of refined grain foods, because the studies within these meta-analyses also show that total grain intake, the sum of both whole and refined grain foods, is not associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. So for the consumer, this means that while they should be focused on increasing consumption of whole grains, it's not necessary to limit the consumption of refined grain foods. Refined grain foods can't fit in a healthy diet.